The morning sun filtered in through the worn curtains of my small apartment, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the quiet. I had risen early, as I always did, with a rhythm that age tends to carve into the bones, regardless of the occasion. But this morning was different. It wasn't just any day, it was Jacob's graduation. My grandson, the one I used to rock to sleep when his mother, my daughter Laura, needed rest. The one who cried in my arms the day his dog died. The one who used to draw pictures of the two of us fishing and insist on taping them to my fridge. I had received no official invitation from Laura, of course, but Jacob had sent me a message weeks ago, a simple, earnest text saying, "Hope you'll be there, Grandpa. It wouldn't feel right without you." That message stayed with me. I had even taken my old suit to the dry cleaner, pressed my shirt, polished my shoes until they shone like memories I didn't dare speak aloud. I had rehearsed what I'd say to Jacob, maybe even to Laura, if she allowed a brief moment of civility. I imagined sitting quietly at the back, blending in, clapping politely, and leaving without a fuss. I didn't want attention. I just wanted to be there. I just wanted to see him. I was stirring sugar into my coffee when my phone buzzed. Laura. Her name flashed across the screen, the same as it had the night she first moved out, the night she told me she needed space, the night she said I made everything heavier. For a heartbeat, I felt hope. Maybe she was reaching out to mend something. Maybe time had softened her edges. I played the voice message with trembling hands. Her voice, always so sharp when it turned cold, came through without hesitation. "Better if you don't come today. You embarrass us. It's Jacob's day. Let's not make it about you." There was no anger, no rage, no cruelty shouted in haste. Just calm, composed rejection, the kind that leaves no room for misunderstanding. I stood still, holding the phone to my ear long after the message ended. I didn't reply. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't cry. I sat down slowly, placed the coffee cup on the table, and stared at the small stack of photos I had set aside to give to Jacob, pictures of him with Mary, my late wife, of him as a baby on our porch swing, of him asleep in my lap during thunderstorms. They looked back at me now with a kind of still defiance. I tucked them back into their envelope, and I made a decision. I wouldn't go. I wouldn't dress. I wouldn't force myself into a place where I wasn't wanted, where my presence was an offense to be managed like a stain on the family name. But something inside me, something old and deep, shifted. Not broken, no, not that. Broken things can sometimes be mended. This was quieter, deeper, like a tide changing course under a still ocean. I had given Laura everything: time, money, the roof she slept under, the car she drove, the tuition she never repaid. I gave and gave and gave until I became invisible. If my presence was shameful, then I would show her the weight of my absence. I would not scream. I would not argue. I would not beg for a seat that bore my blood. But I would be remembered, not for bitterness, not for revenge, but for precision. I poured the untouched coffee down the drain, changed into something plain, and sat by the window as the sky lightened. I listened to the city begin its day, cars and birds and footsteps, all unaware that something irreversible had begun. I would not ruin Jacob's day. I would not make it about me. But in that moment, I vowed something far simpler and far colder. If they thought my silence was defeat, they had never truly listened to what silence could do. I didn't drive toward the ceremony that morning, but my hands gripped the steering wheel longer than they should have. Old habits, I suppose. I sat parked in the same spot I used to wait for Jacob after school, watching the sun trace lines across the windshield, feeling the phantom weight of a future that should have welcomed me. I knew the venue well, a grand hall rented at great expense, no doubt paid with money I had, at some point, quietly supplemented. I didn't need to walk inside to see how it would look. flowers clinging to pillars like nervous guests, rows of chairs lined in disciplined symmetry, proud parents in Sunday best rehearsing their applause. I could see the stage, the red carpet, the pretentious program with names etched in gold foil, and somewhere in all of that, I imagined there was a chair, a single chair with my name, quietly reserved by the only soul in that family who hadn't yet been taught to erase me. I confirmed it hours later, not by accusation but by conversation, a whispered exchange with a former colleague, who now freelanced with the event company. He had seen the name on the spreadsheet, Seat 17C, reserved, grandfather, Mr. Harold Emmett. Wasn't much, just a line in a digital file. But someone had noticed it, objected, and ordered it removed. The seat was pulled hours before guests arrived. No explanation given, no backup plan offered. Just a decision carried out in silence, the kind that tastes like finality. My friend didn't want to tell me, but I insisted. I needed to know if Jacob had tried, and he had. That mattered. That meant more than Laura's voice ever could. I went home in silence, letting the city hum around me like background noise to a scene I hadn't been cast in. I took off my shoes and sat at my desk, where the envelope of photos still lay untouched. I looked at them again, not with nostalgia but with purpose. Each picture had a story Laura pretended never happened, memories she either suppressed or twisted into burdens. But Jacob remembered. I had watched the boy grow up with eyes too gentle to fake affection, too young to carry the weight his mother forced him to hold. And now, with one empty chair, I had all the proof I needed that he had resisted her, even if quietly. That alone deserved a response. I opened my drawer and pulled out a black folder, worn at the edges but always meticulously organized. Inside were contact numbers, emails, contracts from another life before arthritis crept into my knuckles, before Laura grew ashamed of the man who once built stage backdrops and lighting rigs for government ceremonies, military events, and even televised galas. I had once been the invisible hand that made things happen in the background, the one who knew who to call and how to stay unseen. I wasn't going to crash the party. I was going to direct it, invisibly, surgically. I made phone calls that evening, one to a former audiovisual technician whose loyalty was sealed long ago by a favor I had never cashed in, and another to a media editor who owed me more than he'd admit. I asked for something simple, a 5-minute tribute video. It would be packaged like a standard graduation feature, disguised as a surprise family segment. The kind of thing that doesn't raise questions until it's too late. I sent them photos, footage, and one very specific audio file. I told them exactly where to insert it. I gave instructions for tone: nostalgic, sentimental, not vengeful. This wasn't about venom. It was about memory, and what happens when people are forced to see what they've tried to forget. The technician chuckled nervously, asked if I was sure. I didn't laugh. I simply said, if they erased a chair, I'll give them something they can't erase. And that was it. The plan was in motion. I wasn't going to shout in the parking lot or beg for scraps at the family table. I had spent years being the man who built scenes for other people's applause. Now, for once, I would build one for silence crafted so precisely that the only sound left will be the one Laura never expected to hear. Hers, echoing across a room filled with faces that would finally see what I had seen for far too long. I didn't sleep much that night, not because of anger or restlessness, but because something deeper had shifted, a quiet clarity that only comes after a lifetime of being spoken over. I sat in the same chair I always did, in the small study that smelled faintly of old wood and liniment, with the television off and the lights low. The photos I had chosen for the video lay stacked neatly beside my elbow, each one selected with the precision of someone who knew exactly what memories weighed more than others. I was never a loud man, even when Laura was young, and I still believed I could shape her into someone kind. I used silence like a tool, not as punishment but as presence. Now, in the darkest hour before dawn, I found myself back in that role, shaping things from the shadows, guiding hands without ever being seen. The email from the technician had arrived just before midnight. "Got it all," it read. "We'll package it into the family tribute reel. We'll run as scheduled unless pulled last minute," which it won't be. I knew it wouldn't. He had worked enough events to understand that once a file was queued into the master presentation, it would run as planned unless someone raised a major objection. And nobody would, because my name wasn't on the file, and the footage had been submitted under the name Jacob's Family Memories. It was flawless camouflage. No one suspects the harmless old man when he walks away, without a word. That's the first mistake they make. The video began simply, just as I had instructed. Soft piano music, golden hued transitions between childhood clips, birthday candles, a toddler version of Laura riding my shoulders at a summer fair, then Jacob taking his first steps, my hands steadying his back. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence designed to lull the audience into sentimentality, the kind people crave at ceremonies like this. I had written it like a lullaby at first, not out of deception, but to cradle their expectations just long enough to drop them. I had chosen one specific photograph: Laura, no older than 10, sitting on my lap, clutching a teddy bear I had patched together myself from leftover upholstery scraps. That photo would pause on screen for 2 seconds longer than the rest, just enough time to let the audience feel something tender. And then, the next frame, the audio waveform. No name, no title, just a sudden change from the warm piano to silence. And then her voice, played without filter, without context, without mercy. "Better not come. You embarrass us." The audience wouldn't be prepared. That was the point. You don't warn people before the lights go out. You let their eyes adjust. You let the truth find them unguarded. I had anticipated their reactions, mapped them in my mind like a staged diagram. A few would gasp, others would squint at the screen, unsure if they heard it right. But someone would look at Laura, and then another, and another. And soon, all eyes would shift not to the stage, not to the graduating class, but to the woman who had condemned a man without giving him a voice, and now found hers echoing through a room she couldn't control. The script had been flipped, and I wasn't just a character anymore. I was the author. By morning, everything was locked in. The technician confirmed the final cue points and said only, "It's done." I didn't need to ask if he watched the full video. He had. That's how I knew it would land exactly as intended. This wasn't just about humiliation. That would be too small, too fleeting. This was about permanence. About placing a memory so deep in their celebration that no amount of flowers, music, or applause could drown it out. They tried to erase a seat. I replaced it with a monument. I got dressed that afternoon, as if I were attending. Pressed shirt, polished shoes, cologne dabbed at the neck the way Margaret used to like. I didn't plan to go inside, but I needed to look like I belonged. Because I did. More than any of them realized. I parked down the block, angled just enough to see the venue entrance, but far enough that no one would spot me. I brought a small transistor radio and a book of crossword puzzles, but I didn't touch either. I just sat there, hands on the wheel, eyes fixed on the glass doors. I waited. And when the time came when the video played and the hall paused, I felt no satisfaction, no grin of revenge. No swelling pride, just stillness, like a painter stepping back from the canvas, not to gloat, but to observe the silence between the brushstrokes. They had written me out of their story, but they forgot I taught them how stories are told. I don't remember blinking in those few seconds when the lights dimmed and the video began to roll. From where I sat, across the parking lot inside the quiet interior of my old car, the silence from inside the venue seemed to ripple outward like a slow-moving tremor. It reached even me, through the closed windows, through the idle hum of the engine and the ticking of the clock on the dashboard. I had timed it with precision. The program listed the family tribute montage at 6:45 p.m., just after the speech by the vice principal and before the awards ceremony. The guests, full of wine and sentiment, would expect the usual: soft music, baby photos, perhaps a few tears from proud parents. And it began exactly that way. The technician had followed the timeline perfectly. First came the images of children smiling with missing teeth, awkward teenage braces, birthday cakes glowing in darkened rooms. There were polite chuckles, hands covering mouths, the collective warmth of shared nostalgia. Then the footage shifted, as I knew it would, to Jacob's section. His early days, his scraped knees, the time he fell asleep with his head against my shoulder during a fireworks show. The crowd cooed. My daughter was beaming. Then the photograph I chose, the one with her in that tattered yellow dress, sunburn on her nose, her arms wrapped tightly around my neck like I was the last solid thing in a world of smoke. It hung on the screen a moment longer than the others. A breath, a pause, an opening. The music faded. The transition stopped. And then it came. Her voice, clear, clinical, dismissive. Better not come. You embarrass us. No context. No lead-in. No softening. The room, I imagined, blinked all at once. The silence was absolute, the kind that vibrates in the bones rather than the ears. From my car, I saw a few people rise from their seats in confusion. The technician, faithful to his promise, had let the clip run again, a loop of the audio, her words cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Then the next image, a photo of me in uniform, younger, holding Laura in front of a rusted pickup truck. Then another, me building her a treehouse with bloodied fingers and no power tools. And another, my hand in hers at her first piano recital, the light from the church windows catching the tears I tried to hide. And then, again, her voice, better not come. You embarrass us, played once more, louder this time. Someone gasped. Someone whispered, did she really say that? And I imagined Jacob, poor boy, burying his face in his hands. He had tried. He had reserved me a seat, asked to see me afterward. But she had made sure the chair was gone before I could ever arrive. I didn't blame him. He was a good boy, just afraid, just trying to love everyone at once. Through the windshield, I saw Laura stand slowly from her table, lips moving but no words coming. Her husband placed a hand on her arm, uncertain, faces turned, eyes narrowed. The energy in the room had shifted completely, not in outrage but in something more dangerous, understanding, the kind that can't be undone. They remembered how I used to walk her to school, how I sold the truck to pay for her tuition, how I showed up to every concert even when I could barely breathe from the medications. The old stories, the ones she had worked so hard to bury beneath charity events and Instagram posts, began to resurface in their minds. That's the thing about history. It doesn't disappear, it waits, patiently. And now it had arrived, not with rage, not with violence, but with truth, with her own voice as a witness. I didn't need to show my face. My absence, once framed as shame, now radiated purpose. People would talk, not just that night, but for weeks, months, maybe years. The old man who didn't show up, the message that played, the photos that followed, the timeline that no longer fit her version of events. I didn't want them to hate her. That would be too easy. I wanted them to see her, really see her, and know what she had done. I turned the key and shut off the engine. The sky was darkening, the streetlights humming awake. I waited for the first guests to exit the hall, their expressions as predictable as the changing of seasons. Some looked bewildered, others pale. Some avoided looking at her as they passed. A few glanced over their shoulders, as if checking whether the man in the pictures might appear in the flesh. But I remained where I was, invisible, not out of shame, but because I had no need to step into a room where my shadow had already done the speaking. The party was not mine, but the silence that followed, that belonged to me. I didn't need to open the car door to feel the temperature change. It rolled outward from the event hall like a pressure front before a storm charged, uncertain, stunned into stillness. The guests spilled into the night one by one, blinking beneath the harsh glare of street lamps, their voices hushed and movements careful, like witnesses leaving the scene of something sacred and unspeakable. They clutched their programs like shields, avoiding one another's gaze, as if the truth projected minutes earlier still lingered in the air like static. My daughter walked out last, alone. Her husband trailed behind at a distance, not speaking, not reaching for her hand. She had one heel off, carrying it like an afterthought, the rhythm of her steps broken. The first wave of whispers didn't come from strangers, but from the people closest, Jacob's classmates' parents, the aunts and uncles who'd flown in from out of state, even her closest friend, the one who always brought deviled eggs to family barbecues and never stopped reminding people she'd known Laura since high school. But there was nothing to say in her defense. The words in that audio clip hadn't been twisted or edited. They were hers, crisp and sharp and cruel, floating out over a sea of celebratory banners and glittering streamers, interrupting a night meant for pride and turning it into something else entirely. No one saw it coming, and that was the point. Inside the car, I watched their faces shift in real time, some softened with regret, some hardened with judgment. The crowd had expected smiles and accolades, had arrived with corsages and good wishes. But now they left carrying something heavier, the uncomfortable knowledge that they had clapped for a woman who had, without hesitation, cast out the very man whose sacrifices had paved her path. And as they passed her on the sidewalk, few stopped to offer condolences or apologies. Most simply walked faster. Some crossed the street. A child, no older than 7, tugged at his mother's dress and whispered, "Why was that lady so mean?" The mother didn't answer. Laura kept her chin up, but I recognized the way her eyes moved, scanning for someone, anyone, who might still be on her side. And finding none, she looked for Jacob, but he had gone back inside. I imagined what he must be feeling in that moment, torn between love and loyalty, between the grandmother who had bounced him on her knees and the mother, who now looked smaller than ever in her trembling silence. He had invited me in secret, had saved me a seat, had hoped for peace, maybe even a moment of reconciliation. But she had ensured I would never walk through those doors. And now he was left with the fallout. That was never my intention to hurt him. But some truths don't go quietly. They crack through the surface like roots beneath concrete, reshaping the ground whether you want them to or not. The venue staff began clearing the decorations, tugging down the string lights and folding up the white chairs that had lined the walls. I saw one of them glance toward Laura, then quickly look away. She stood like a statue on the sidewalk, eyes vacant, clutching her phone as though waiting for a message that would never arrive. And in that moment, something changed. Not for her, for me. I no longer felt the weight I had carried for so long, the ache of being pushed aside, of swallowing years of disappointments and small betrayals dressed up as misunderstandings. That weight shifted, lightened, not because I had sought revenge, but because I had finally let truth speak in my place. I had not shouted. I had not argued. I had not demanded to be seen. I simply showed them what had already been there all along. I turned the key again and let the engine hum back to life. My fingers rested on the steering wheel for a few extra seconds, the soft leather worn down by time and habit. Then I drove away, slowly, careful not to draw attention. The road was quiet. The night folded in around me like a cloak. In the rearview mirror, the venue faded into distance, its windows still glowing, though dimmer now, less celebratory. There would be calls tomorrow, texts, Maybe even apologies from people who hadn't spoken to me in years. But I wouldn't answer them. Not yet. Because silence, when chosen rather than imposed, is its own kind of language, and mine had just begun to speak. The drive back to her house would have been quiet if not for the thud of her own thoughts, slamming against her temples like fists in a locked room. I imagined it the way Laura sat in the passenger seat, arms folded so tight they hurt, her husband too ashamed or afraid to fill the silence, the radio off, the hum of the tires on asphalt the only sound bridging the canyon between them. She would replay the moment again and again, trying to convince herself there had been a mistake, a glitch, a betrayal of some kind, never admitting that the only betrayal that mattered had been hers. They would pull into the driveway, too early in the evening for the neighbors to be asleep, too late for any sense of normalcy to still linger. Porch light on, motion sensor flickering, and there, halfway folded in the mailbox like any other bill or pizza flyer, would be the envelope. Not white, not cream, but gray. A deliberate choice. Something that wouldn't be mistaken for junk or overlooked in a pile. Her name printed in stark black ink. No return address. No stamp. Inside, a single page. Thick paper. Legal font. The notice was brief, less than a paragraph, cold, clear, professional. It stated that the lease agreement for the car she drove, the one she posted about online, the one she called a reward for all her hard work, was being terminated. Not because of missed payments, no, that would have been forgivable, but because the co-signer, the legal owner, the man whose name was still on the title, had revoked his consent. A clause she hadn't read, or had, and assumed would never be invoked. The paper stated that she had 72 hours to return the vehicle to the nearest dealership. After that, it would be subject to immediate repossession. And just like that, the wheels beneath her feet, the emblem she flashed at valet stations and photo ops, became a countdown. I pictured her standing there on the porch, reading it under the porch light, the white bulbs casting a hard edge on her face. She'd read it twice, then again, then storm inside, toss it on the kitchen island, demand answers from her husband who didn't have any. Maybe she'd even try to call me. Maybe the number would still ring. But she'd know better than to believe I would answer. Not after the audio. Not after the chair was removed. Not after she erased me from the ceremony of a boy who still remembered my birthday every year and sent me hand-drawn cards. She had made her decision. I was simply helping her live with it. It wasn't about the car. It was about the gesture. The vehicle had been her trophy, her proof of success, her unspoken signal to the world that she had risen above her roots, carved out a place for herself in a tier her father had never touched. But I had touched it. I had built it. I had carried bricks in both hands while raising her with the other. And if she had forgotten that, if she had twisted the story so that I was the weight, not the scaffold, then it was time she remembered where the foundation came from. The dealership would call her in the morning. They always did, polite but firm. The process was impersonal, legal, almost surgical. Her name would no longer appear in their system. They would need the keys. They would need the vehicle in undamaged condition. They would remind her that breach of contract could affect her credit. She would say it wasn't fair. She would blame the system. But fairness is a scale, and for too long, mine had been tipped under the weight of her indifference. Tonight, that changed. Tonight, she walked into her perfect house in her perfect neighborhood and found a fracture in the floor. Meanwhile, I sat alone at my kitchen table, the same table that had once held birthday cakes for her, science projects, college brochures. I poured myself a cup of lukewarm tea and stared at the empty chair across from me, the one she used to climb onto before her feet could touch the floor, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. This wasn't cruelty. This was correction. She had made it clear I was a burden in public, so I returned the sentiment in private, quietly, legally, efficiently. The difference between us was that I still remembered the value of silence. I let mine speak, and soon it would echo through every corner of her curated world. There are absences so subtle, so perfectly engineered, that no one notices until the very moment they are needed. And when they are finally noticed, they don't explode. They implode quietly, thoroughly, collapsing the architecture of expectation from within. That's what I designed. Not an act of revenge. Not exactly, but a correction of record. A redirection of what was once blindly promised to someone who now saw me as disposable. It began with a fund and account built over years, a modest but meaningful cushion, meant to help launch a bright young man into a future I'd once believed I would witness from the front row. It had my name on it legally fully, not just as a benefactor, but as the sole controller of disbursement. It was a technicality at first, a precaution, a habit from an era when signatures meant trust. But now, it was a lever, and all I had to do was pull. The Monday after the formatura, the boy walked into the admissions office of the university he had always dreamed of attending. He was dressed sharp blue shirt, pressed trousers, his grandfather's watch ticking softly on his wrist. He had applied early, had been accepted with honors, and was now coming in to finalize the next step, financial release. He smiled, confident, handed over the forms, and waited while the clerk typed and clicked and frowned. She asked for a moment, then another. Then she returned with a different person. They led him to a quieter desk. Apologies were offered. There must be a mistake. The fund appears to have been closed, cleared, zeroed. Not a freeze, not a miscommunication. The assets were moved 2 weeks prior to another account, under a different designation. Not illegal, just redirected. Legally airtight, irreversible. The shock didn't come all at once. It came in waves, lapping against the edges of the narrative his mother had built for him all these years. That grandpa would always be there, that his love was given, not earned. That family was something you could outgrow but still harvest from like an eternal tree. I didn't enjoy the idea of him sitting there, confused and embarrassed. He was a good boy, or at least had been, but he had also sat in silence while they erased my name from his ceremony. He had watched as the chair was removed. He had heard the audio, and he had said nothing. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Maybe he thought silence was safer. But silence is an answer too. I didn't strip him of a future. I simply removed the assumption that it would be paid for by someone whose dignity he helped erase. I transferred the money to a new trust. The papers were filed through my lawyer, quiet as breath. Months before the ceremony, the new beneficiary, a different grandson, a name nearly forgotten, buried under years of awkward holidays and forced smiles, the son of my second daughter, estranged, quieter, passed over by the family pecking order, because he didn't fit the curated image my eldest tried so hard to project. That boy sent me letters, real letters on paper. He asked questions about our ancestry. He included sketches he made in pencil, his lines careful, observant. He called me on my birthday, sometimes even on days when nothing special was marked on the calendar. He was not perfect, but he was kind, and when I told him through my lawyer that a fund had appeared in his name, he didn't ask why. He just said, "Thank you." 2 words. That was enough. Laura found out the same way her son did. She stormed into my lawyer's office, eyes blazing with the righteousness of someone who believes blood should come with interest. She demanded to see the documents. He showed them. She threatened litigation. He pointed to the signatures, hers included, from an old form, signed without reading. She had ceded any claim to financial control long ago, during a time when she thought me too old to bother watching closely. But I had always watched. Her outrage turned into disbelief. Her disbelief turned into tears. And the lawyer, calm, kind, impersonal, offered her tissues without a word. Back at home, I poured myself a glass of water. Not whiskey, not tea. Just water. Clean, cold, honest. I thought of my grandson with the sketches. How he would one day sit in a lecture hall paid for by a man he never manipulated. I thought of the other boy, now scrambling to find alternative options, wondering how quickly admiration turns to absence. I didn't hate him, but I no longer felt obligated to carry him. Family is not a transaction, but if you try to turn it into one, don't be surprised when the account closes. Quietly, without notice, without apology. The letter arrived folded once, neatly, its envelope crisp and unassuming, bearing the return address of a local newspaper that had long since faded from her memory. She might have tossed it if it hadn't been hand-delivered by the same mailman who used to greet me with a respectful nod when I still walked those sidewalks. She opened it with a fluttering hesitation, perhaps sensing that it did not belong to the rhythm of her usual correspondent Snowbank logo. No brand advertising, just her name, printed plainly, in a font that offered no warmth. Inside was a clipping, a full-page feature spread headlined in modest type. The uninvited ones, when families silence their elders. No names, no accusations, just my face older now, deeply lined but not broken, staring out from a black and white photograph taken years ago at a community event she hadn't attended. She must have read the first lines and then stopped breathing, because although the article never once used her name, every anecdote, every timeline, every shade of truth was a mirror. The details were too precise, the story too real. Anyone who knew us would know exactly who the daughter was, especially in a town where stories stick longer than apologies. The piece began not with anger but memory. I had insisted on that. I told the reporter, an old student of mine, years back when I still guest lectured at the local college, that I didn't want to vilify anyone. I just wanted to speak. The world had become too loud, and still somehow, people like me were never really heard. I spoke of the years spent in quiet service, working late shifts, coming home to carry sleeping children from the back seat, watching them grow as I shrank into the background. I spoke of the joy I had felt the first time Laura said "Daddy," how she used to run toward me with reckless abandon when I arrived home. I even spoke of her successes, how proud I had once been. And then I let the pain bleed through, how gradually, then suddenly, my seat at the table had become optional, how phone calls became chores, how birthdays became reminders that I was an accessory, not a pillar. I spoke of that morning, the audio, without quoting it, only describing how it felt to be erased by a voice you once comforted after nightmares. I did not cry in the interview, but the young reporter did. When the story was printed, it circulated quickly, not because it was salacious, but because it was quiet and true. People shared it over coffee, in salons, in waiting rooms. Her friends read it, neighbors whispered. The principal of her son's school pulled her aside, awkwardly, suggesting she take a week off. At the bakery, someone handed her change without a word. At the grocery store, glances followed her down the aisle. Not cruel, just knowing. And that's what broke her. Not outrage, not attack, just the unbearable heaviness of being seen without her costume on. She called me the next day, not to apologize, but to accuse. She said I had betrayed her, that I'd made her look like a monster. I let her speak, let her voice tremble with self-righteousness. And when she finally ran out of breath, I simply asked, what part of the story wasn't true? There was a pause, not long, just long enough to know she had heard herself. Then the call ended. The town didn't riot. They didn't shun her, but they didn't pretend anymore either. The illusion of perfection, so carefully maintained, cracked like porcelain left too long in the sun. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't even need to speak again. The truth had become its own gravity, pulling perceptions into orbit around something she could no longer control. And me, I walked to the park more often. People greeted me with gentle nods, some even with thanks. One woman said, "Your story reminded me to call my father." That was enough. The interview hadn't ruined her. It had simply exposed the scaffolding, holding up a narrative that was never mine to begin with. Now, she stood in open air, without the crowd's applause to muffle her silence. Let her feel it. Let her sit in the space she carved for me. By the time she stepped into the notary's office, it was already too late. The secretary at the front desk offered her a tight, professional smile, the kind reserved for someone whose name had already been whispered in back rooms and lunch breaks, someone whose presence arrived seconds after her reputation. She wore a tailored beige blazer that did nothing to conceal the slight tremble in her fingers. As she signed the visitor log, she believed she was there to clarify a misunderstanding, to undo what she assumed was some clerical mistake, a procedural miscommunication she could fix with one firm tone and a demand for authority. But when she sat down in the small, sunlit office with the framed degrees and the ticking brass clock on the wall, and the notary opened the folder with deliberate calm, she began to understand the gravity of what had been put in motion long before she ever sent that audio message. The will was clear, revised, registered, witnessed, notarized, and legally sound. I had removed her name months before the graduation, knowing that a moment like that would arrive not because I wished for war, but because I could no longer afford the illusion of peace. The contents of the estate house, remaining assets, investments, rights, royalties all transferred to a newly formed foundation under the name of the other grandson, the forgotten boy, the one who never asked for much and never received enough. His name stood proudly in bold, the Elliot James Foundation for Quiet Futures. I had spent weeks designing the trust, ensuring its permanence, consulting with attorneys who specialized in contested wills, and most importantly, I had found the perfect loophole, one she had walked into herself. Months prior, I had invited her for lunch. She had shown up, distracted and late, complaining about parking, oblivious to my real purpose. I had handed her a stack of papers, thin and dense with legal phrasing, and told her they were related to a small reorganization of family holdings. She had barely glanced at the summary before signing, making a joke about how Dad still thinks I'm 20 and need an allowance. That single signature, witnessed and time-stamped, was her renunciation, a voluntary, irreversible waiver of claim to future inheritance, worded with such precision that even her lawyers, weeks later, could only confirm its validity with reluctant nods. She had given up her place in line long before she knew there was a line to begin with. The rage, I'm told, was volcanic. Not in public, not right away, but behind closed doors, where furniture was shoved and voices shattered against drywall. She couldn't accuse me of theft, couldn't call it betrayal. Every paper was legal, every action considered. And the worst part, perhaps, was that I never gloated. I never wrote to taunt her, never appeared in person to gloat. I let the silence do the carving. At the office, she asked, her voice tight, if anything could be reversed. The notary answered with the precision of a scalpel. Only if fraud could be proven. But the documents were authenticated. The witness was real, and the motive, her own convenience, had already been documented in prior correspondence. She left without taking a copy. Perhaps she didn't want the finality of it in her hands. But I kept mine, archived in a drawer with decades of other forgotten things, report cards, birthday cards, photographs from simpler times. I didn't burn those old memories. I didn't erase her completely, but I moved on. And in that moving, I made sure the echo of her decision, the one that told me I was ashamed, would ripple through time in ways she couldn't undo. The foundation began receiving letters within a month. Young students, struggling parents, educators from small towns, all asking how they could apply for grants or mentorships. The board comprised of people she never bothered to know, selected recipients based on resilience, silence, and dignity. No headlines, no ceremonies, just quiet impact, just the opposite of everything she had become. And still, I said nothing. I didn't attend the first board meeting. I didn't speak at the press briefing. I let the structure of the will speak for me. It had more weight than any confrontation ever could. She had erased me from her event. I had erased her from my legacy, not in vengeance, but in consequence. Not in cruelty, but in clarity. Let her tell whatever story she needs to sleep at night. I don't require a villain, only peace. And peace, I've learned, often wears the face of absence. She waited 6 days before breaking the silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from distance or avoidance, but the one thick with shame, panic, and belated understanding, the kind that grows like mold in the dark corners of regret. 6 days of unanswered questions echoing in her mind, of wondering who else had seen the video, what the neighbors whispered when they walked past her door a little too slowly, or why even her closest friends avoided eye contact during their morning coffee meetups. She had made the mistake of assuming that silence meant irrelevance, that because I had never raised my voice or argued back, I was someone who could be easily erased. But now, sitting at the edge of a bed she could no longer afford to keep, in a house whose walls seemed to lean in with judgment, she opened her phone and recorded a voice message. It was short. She didn't dare to call. Perhaps the words would have cracked if spoken aloud. Perhaps she feared I might answer. "Dad," she began, her voice already unraveling. "I'm sorry for what I said. I didn't mean it. I don't know why I said it. I was stressed. I thought it was for the best. Please, can we talk?" She paused before sending it, staring at her reflection in the screen, trying to see the daughter she used to be, the one who laughed in the kitchen as a teenager, the one who hugged me without needing a reason, the one I carried on my shoulders until my back ached for days. But the woman who pressed send was someone else, someone made of deflection and entitlement, who had mistaken comfort for currency, who had calculated every family gesture like a transaction until nothing remained but the receipt. The message delivered. The 2 blue check marks appeared within seconds. And then, nothing. No reply. No bubble indicating I was typing. No accidental callback. Just a brutal confirmation that I had read it and chosen silence. Not out of cruelty, not to inflict pain, but because, at last, the math was balanced. For years I had swallowed the bitterness she served at every family gathering, laughed at jokes made at my expense, excused her absence with invented stories to protect her from the judgment of others. I had shown up, birthdays, recitals, hospital stays. I was there, always slightly to the side, always peripheral but constant. And yet the one time it mattered, the one moment, when my presence would have meant something more than habit, I was told I was a stain, an embarrassment, a shadow too dark for her perfect day. And that was when something inside me shifted, not into hate, but into clarity. It was never about that day alone. It was about every day before that, about the slow erosion of value, the invisible aging of someone who had become more relic than father in her eyes. So I responded in the only language that still held weight, not with rage, but with removal. She would live now with the shape of my absence, and absence carved precisely where she had once built her comfort. The car repossessed, the tuition fund redirected, the community that once smiled at her now looking away, and most deeply, the will, not for the money, though that mattered, but for what it represented. Proved that even someone as quiet as I had a final say, that love has a limit, and silence, when earned, is the most unforgiving answer of all. I did not block her. I did not erase the message. I let it sit there, marked as read, forever suspended between what she said and what she wished she had said instead. Let her return to it in the dark hours. Let her replay it when the house feels colder than it used to. Let her remember the man who used to fix the roof, carry the groceries, pay the debts without ever mentioning them. Let her wonder when exactly she lost him. The tragedy isn't that she was punished. It's that she didn't know she was loved until it was no longer offered. I still see my grandson sometimes. Not in person, but I follow the foundation's updates. I know he applied for a program abroad. I know he volunteers now at a senior home, reading to men like me. Maybe one day he'll understand what I did and why. Maybe one day he'll visit, not to apologize, but to listen. Until then, I walk through my house with a quiet that doesn't ache anymore. I water the plants. I read the paper. I sit in the sun, and I let the silence bloom. Because the truth is, some wounds deserve no reply. Some stories end not with confrontation, but with the door never opening again. And that silence unbroken, deliberate, eternal is the most honest goodbye I have left to give.